Now, tonight I'm talking about Cuming Smith and Company, who were in Melbourne and Yarraville along the river there. And Cuming himself, James Cuming, arrived from Canada with his father and other brothers. And he was a vet, and his father was a vet, and I think one of the other brothers was a vet too. But he had a particular interest in farming, and when he arrived in Melbourne, he decided to get into the fertiliser business. Now, I'll just move on to the next. That photo on the left, if you can see that, is Cuming Smith and Company. They're in 65 William Street in Melbourne, and that was their head office. And their brand was Sickle brand, which is trademarked. And they used that right through the life on timber and fertiliser and everything else. Now, the area they're in, this is a 1938 map of the Warburton area, which shows Yarra Junction and Britannia Creek. You can see there just where the track ran up following the creek right through, and the distillation works was built there. I'll come back to the map later. Now, he arrived in Melbourne in 1862 from St John, New Brunswick. He purchased the Yarraville Chemical Works of Robert Smith and Company, which is how you came to get Cuming Smith. He purchased McMeekin's Victoria Bone Mill, which was also along the Maribyrnong, although at that stage it was called the Yarra River. They hadn't renamed it. And he established a factory to manufacture acids and then superphosphate on the bank of the Maribyrnong River in Yarraville. During the 1890s, Australia suffered a major economic depression, which caused the cost of imported chemicals and fertilisers to soar. Cuming Smith and Company survived and decided to investigate the opportunity to produce the needed chemicals using waste wood left over from forest timber harvesting. James had a strong interest in agriculture and farming practices in particular, and after a world tour in 1904, visiting experimental distillation plants that had been built in England and Germany, he decided, after consultation with the Forest Commission, to build a distillation works at Britannia Creek near Wesburn. In 1906-1907, he constructed the distillation works, which aimed to produce acetic acid by the distillation of eucalyptus timber. They registered the Britannia Sawmills Company on the 12th of February 1907 and obtained a licence from the Forest Commission for a tramway easement and a grazing licence for their tramway horses. The company signed an agreement with the Victorian Railways in 1908 for the provision of a siding on the Lilydale to Warburton Railway near Yarra Junction to service the distillation works and sawmills. The works took a year to build and cost £50,000. A grand opening dinner was held at the Yarra Junction Mechanics Hall in August 1907, after which the plant commenced operation. There are photos of this grand. It was a very formal occasion, lots of dinner suits and top hats and everything. Amazing. When someone spends $50,000 in the area, everyone and their grandmother turns out. Now, this is a photo of the works in 1917. You got the various retorts and distillation ovens and what have you there, drying ovens. There's quite a good little book that Cuming Smith put out at the time, which showed how the process worked. Now, the interesting thing is that they did have a steel line running down to Britannia siding on the VR Warburton line, and at first they used horses, and then they changed and put a loco in, and that's the loco at the entrance to Britannia Creek Works in 1917, and that's James Cuming there leaning against the fence. The timber was brought down from further up the tramway where the Allens looked after a couple of the timber mills, 1 and 2. It was split at the number 2 mill, and then it came down and was loaded into these carts and then put into the drying ovens. They put 4 of those wagons into a drying oven at a time for it to dry, which took about 24 hours. So on the left, you've got the chute incline, which came down from the bush mills, and there were cable work putting the loaded bogies down and hauling the other empty ones back up. On the right, you've got a photograph showing the timber stacks, which was above the works, and they had a 2-year supply of timber there at all times. So it did partially dry, although it was exposed to the weather, and then it was carted from there down to the works and put into the drying ovens. And then after that, it went into the distillation, and once it was cooked, you ended up with coke, which was used quite extensively at the time, so it was always in demand, and the acid was collected from the distillation. Now, distillation works employed up to 100 men, and it dried approximately 20,000 tonne of timber from the forest each year. The sawmills were all connected to Britannia Creek Works by the tram line. They were mostly hauled by horses, which transported the sawn timber and split billets to the works. And then sawn timber, which was scantling lumber, cut into 4x2s, 6x2s, and what have you, which was from the better class of logs, was taken through the Britannia siding, and that was sold to various wholesalers in Melbourne. As I said, the dried billets were fed into the retort in rail trucks and cooked for 30 hours. Oxygen-free combustion produced approximately 40 different chemicals, leaving charcoal as the residue. The main item produced was acetone, which was in great demand during the First World War. Methylated spirits and denatured alcohol were other products. Some of these chemicals were sold in 3-gallon stoneware demijohns, which were produced for Cuming, Smith and Company by the Bendigo Potteries. And I've got a photo of one of those further on. All these items, including bags of charcoal, were transported to the Yarraville Works by Victorian Railways. The works have a large frontage to the Yarra, low to the Maribyrnong River, and are connected throughout the works by numerous tramways. And the yearly output of chemical fertilisers in 1909 was 50,000 tonnes. So it was a fairly large operation, and James Cuming was a pretty smart man. He had done a chemistry degree at Melbourne University, and then went overseas to see how he could get into distilling timber to produce his chemicals he needed. So the amount of capital that was put into this area was quite large. Britannia Creek sawmills in 1921 were valued at £20,000. The distillation works was valued at £46,000 odd, and the Mississippi sawmills was valued at £23,000. The works were destroyed in the 1926 bushfires, and the site was later sold to Samuel Bedgood, who established a sawmill on the site. So up above the works and above the chute incline, was number 2 mill, where they were splitting the retort timber. It was loaded onto bogie wagons and then lowered down to the works. And the shot on the left shows James Cuming and Frank Yelland. Now, Frank Yelland was their bush manager. He operated the tramway and supervised the number 1 and number 2 mills, and also supervised all the falling of the timber. And it was quite an efficient operation. The scantling timber was taken initially by horse tram down to Britannia siding. And as I say, this was usually timber that had been ordered by some of the wholesalers in Melbourne for building houses. They did various sizes and they graded the timber, the logs that they were falling up along the number 2 and number 1 mill. There were some quite good trees there, and they were able to get really good quality timber out of that. And later we'll find that they started seasoning it all and turning it into flooring and architrave skirts and everything else. Pardon me. This is a shot of the Warburton Railway with a passenger train coming around. And that shows there in the middle the loaded bogie wagons on the tramway, and scantling is being sorted and loaded into the VR trucks. And also on the left, you see there's a whole lot of timber racks where they kept different sizes. If it wasn't required for an order, they had a fair amount of stock there. And as I say, it was a very efficient operation. Now, Cuming Smith had purchased the Yarraville Chemical Works of Robert Smith's and Company in 1871. They also purchased McMeekin's Bone Mill and then amalgamated with Felton Grimwade in 1897. Grimwade was also one of the directors of Cuming Smith and Company. The Yarraville Works pioneered the manufacture of chemical fertiliser and introduced processes for chemical and acid manufacture, in which the Britannia Creek Works later played a big part. Cuming Smith marketed their agricultural products under the Sickle brand, and their sheep dip, rabbit poison and wheat pickling chemicals were famous with farmers throughout Australia, and they also exported a fair amount of it to overseas countries. They also experimented with timber-derived products such as wood tar and timber preservatives, creosote and things like that. The manufacture of agricultural fertiliser became the main part of Cuming Smith's business and was sold as superphosphate under the Florida brand, which is quite interesting that they would choose a name like Florida, but anyway, that's the way it was. The registered trademark is a sickle, which is the company's guarantee of absolute purity and value. Cuming Smith and Company continued to expand the sawmilling activities in the Warburton Ranges. In 1917, they purchased the Mississippi Sawmills and operated that as the Mississippi Sawmilling Company. This company was wound up in 1923, and all the assets were transferred across to Cuming Smith and Company. Now, out at Big Pat's Creek, Grant Brothers had built a timber seasoning works in 1914, and they were reasonably smart operators and had developed their own process to season hardwood timber from their own sawmill, and they had proved very successful. So they later patented their idea, and then they were able to license it to other users, one of which was Cuming Smith and Company. Frank Yelland was in charge of all the harvesting, sawmilling and seasoning business in the Warburton area. Grant's Seasoning Works was acquired by Cuming Smith and Company in 1919, along with a license to use the process, and they paid Grant's royalties for every year that they operated. Initially, they supplied the works with sawn timber from the Mississippi mills until that area was logged out. And that's an early shot in 1906 of the Mississippi tram line, wooden railed and horse-drawn. There's quite a few photos circulating around over the years showing them gravity taking the loaded trucks down to Warburton initially, and then where they tramway ran right into Warburton railway yards, which became very crowded. And in the end, when the railways had extended out to Lala siding, they diverted their timber, which was by then for Cuming Smith, into Lala siding. These tram lines were fairly well constructed, and that's a bridge over one of the creeks there. And they had to have complete sleepers and timbering all the way through, because you're pulling your wagons down by horse, so you can't have anything where the horse is going to stumble. Usually what happened was, once you brought your loaded timber down to the siding, then they disconnected the loaded wagons, hooked the horses onto the empty ones, and they were pulled back up to the mill site. In December 1929, an agreement was signed between Cuming Smith and Company and J.F. Ezard for the supply of sawn hardwood to the seasoning works. This continued for 12 months. The biggest problem all the time was getting decent sawn timber that you could season and then machine down into flooring and other high quality finished timbers, which was always in great demand. Cuming Smith negotiated with Victorian Railways Commissioners for a lease of land at Lala siding on the 20th of August 1919 and completed an indenture for the siding of Britannia Creek on the 23rd of March 1920. The Enterprise Sawmilling and Contracting Company went into liquidation in 1925 after ongoing financial difficulties, and the three partners could not pay their debts. And this was a big problem with a lot of the sawmillers and operators up there, that they didn't have terribly much money, and they required their operations to be fairly skimpy run, whereas Cuming Smith had enormous backing, and they were able to pick up some of these operations, which extended their work with the various timber contractors. Enterprise Sawmilling was sold by a liquidator in September 1920, no, sorry, August 1925, and Cuming Smith was the only purchaser that had the money that could sign up straight away. On September 1925, an agreement was signed between Cuming Smith and Company and Edmund Andrew Robinson for the lease of land on the tram line. Now, Robinson was one of the partners in the Enterprise Sawmilling Company, and they were operating on the other side of the river and up through Cement Creek and Donabew. They had a tram line that went right up there, and a couple of mills. An agreement between the Victorian Railways Commissioners and Cuming Smith concerning the use of the private timber tramway and a storage platform at Lala siding was signed in September 1925. The company started operating the Enterprise mills and tram lines in January 1926 and supplied milled timber to the seasoning works at East Warburton after the supply from the Mississippi mills had ceased. In February 1930, Frank Edwards, who was the manager of the Mississippi Mills operation, advised Mr. Cuming that the number one mill would finish cutting in a week's time and shut down. All the machinery had been removed from the number two mill, and he wanted to know if he could start lifting the steel rails. Cuming Smith and Company investigated the possibility of expanding their operations into other areas in Victoria, but in the end, the directors decided to liquidate all its sawmilling and seasoning assets. The Warburton Ranges operations were very profitable, and the business was valued at £31,000 on closing. Now, this enterprise mill was above Lala siding over the river, and fairly steep country there. It's not a terribly good photo, but that's only one of the ones that Mike McCarthy had that we could find. And you can see timber being lowered down to Lala siding. Now, these are original file documents from Cuming Smith and Company. On the left, it's the timber resources at the Enterprise Mill, and that was prepared by Wilson, who was the manager of the Enterprise operation there for Cuming Smith. And on the right, you can see a Cuming Smith document letterhead where it says sawmills, etc., seasoning works. Now, I'm not sure what the etc. was, but anyway. And down the left-hand side, they had the sickle brand, and then they listed all the things that they produced, which was weatherboards and other architrave skirtings, mouldings. And these came from Cuming Smith files. Sometimes you're in the right spot at the right place. In about 1960, I was wandering around in the city because I worked for a firm of architects in King Street, and I had the address of Cuming Smith, so I went round to where their office was, and when I went in, the receptionist there said that they were closing that office down and moving their operation to Yarraville. And I said, what's happened to all the files? She said, oh, we're just throwing them out. They're going into the rubbish. She said, would you like some? So I said, oh, thank you. That'd be very nice. So I got two folders which went through about 30 years of works of emails and, well, not emails, sorry, memos and replies between Yarraville and the bush at Warburton. And these show on the left, it's Cuming Smith and Company sawmillers, Enterprise Mill, and just setting out some of the things that they were doing. They still supplied bagged charcoal down to Yarraville Works, and they had a big engineering workshop at Yarraville. And so when they needed bits for their tramway bogies, they just ordered the parts, bearings and wheels and that, and they were sent up to Warburton. As I said, it was a pretty slick operation. Discussion was held with the Forest Department about transferring 10 acres of the Mississippi lease to Herman, and if the Forest Department wished to retain the steel rail tramway to Mill Number 2. The Forest Commission notified Cuming Smith on the 22nd of February 1930 that they could remove the tramway between numbers 1 and 2 mills, and a clearance certificate had been issued for number 2 mill and the milling area around it. By September 1930, the mills and tram lines had been closed and the sale of assets began. An auction was held in December 1930 by Cameron, Sutherland and Seward of Riverside Avenue, Melbourne. Mr. A.A. Bingle was Cameron's manager, who handled the auction and the subsequent disposal of the assets that had been sold, including boilers, steel rail and winding gear. I don't think the auction was terribly successful because they still had a fair amount of stuff lying around in a couple of years later, 1933. But some of the item purchased was 5 tonne of 20-pound rail, complete with fish boats, went to Burn and Gracie at Alexandra Railway Station. 6 tonne of 30-pound rail went to S&C Bodinar at Nia West. And one of the Mississippi boilers was sent to the Parwin Colliery and was sent to Parwin Railway Station, where they had to get the boiler inspector to come and do a boiler test on it before the people would pay the money and receive it. Richards also a boiler, and he paid £80 cash for it. As I said, the sawmillers were always short of money. So an interesting point was that all transactions to local sawmillers were to be cash on pickup, and no credit was to be allowed. The disposal of the shunting horses was also discussed with the general manager, and a horse named Clyde was to be sent to the Yarrawul Works to be used to shunt all the trucks around the Yarrawul Works. Now, many years later, when I was working as a project engineer for ICI, I was at Yarrawul Works, and at the time I didn't realise that this was the Cuming Smith Works, and there were remains of railway lines all throughout the works. It was quite an interesting place to wander around, but you weren't allowed to take cameras or do anything. In 1933, a large amount of equipment was still to be collected, and 110 tonne of steel rails was still at the VR Lala siding. Many local sawmillers, including Richards, Horner and Flatman, made offers, and some purchased items that when their offer was accepted. It is interesting to note that in May 1933, Cuming Smith was still producing charcoal at the seasoning works, and that was sent by rail to Commonwealth Fertilisers at Yarrawul. And Commonwealth Fertilisers was a joint venture with Cuming Smith. Now, this is an aerial shot in the 1970s, which gives you an idea of the works that were along the Maribyrnong there. Most of Cuming Smith, which was the ICI Yarrawul Works, has all been demolished now and cleared, and will be there for some time because there's a fair amount of unwanted things in the soil there. But they also had the fertiliser works there, and they bought items in. Mount Lyell Company sent pyrites over from Tasmania, and that was burnt in the works there to create their basic superphosphate. Now, they wanted to expand, and the Western Australians were keen to get a superphosphate works over there. So in 1905, the Mount Lyell Mining and Railway Company established a plant to produce sulphuric acid and superphosphate by smelting lump pyrites ore. This operation was on the site of a pre-existing works owned by Rock Thompson and Parker and Company's Victoria Smelting Works. Cuming Smith amalgamated with Mount Lyell and Wisher and Company, another firm that was doing super, to form Commonwealth Fertilisers and Chemicals in 1929. This business was taken over by ICI in 1936 and continued to operate until the 1990s. The facilities included river wharves, a power plant, workshops, offices, laboratory, and a chlorine and caustic soda works. They covered 11 hectares, employed over 160 people. As part of their expansion into superphosphate production, they expanded into Western Australia and built a superphosphate works at West Guildford. Cuming Smith merged with the Mount Lyell Company to form Cuming Smith and Mount Lyell Farmers Fertilisers in 1927. And that's a photo there is a shot of the Cuming Smith works at Guildford, and it had the sign up there, Florida Superphosphate, manufacturers of sulphuric, nitric, muriatic, and other acids. And the clientele dressed up to the nines. So it must have been a very fancy day when they opened the works there. Now, James Cuming Sr. had two sons, Robert Burns Cuming and James Cuming, or James Cuming Jr. The family migrated to Melbourne in 1862, and Robert Cuming moved to Adelaide and established the Adelaide Chemical Works in 1882. James Jr. studied industrial chemistry, and after a world tour in 1814, so that should be 1914, became head chemist and later manager of the Arable Works. Upon his death at 58 in May 1920, James Cuming Jr. was acknowledged as one of Australia's foremost industrialists. He is commemorated in Footscray as their premier citizen, having been mayor and councillor many times, and there's a statue of him located in the Arable Gardens, which is still there today. So he was quite an operator. The company financed the building of new chemistry buildings at the University of Melbourne, and the University of Melbourne has custody of all the documents, letters and photographs from Cuming Smith and Company operations in Victoria and Western Australia. These were handed over when the company was sold to Wesfarmers. So Cuming Smith still exists in Western Australia. It's part of Wesfarmers, who own Bunnings and all the other spots, and they still produce fertiliser under the Sickle brand. So they were rather an amazing family, an amazing company. They're all that came were either had been in some sort of science or chemistry, and they saw the value of producing fertilisers and other chemicals that we used in the farming. And Australia was wide open then, because everything that we needed for farming in the fertiliser and other chemicals needed to be imported. So James Sr. saw the opportunity there, and he and his sons moved into it in a big way. But also they were a company that saw the value of timber in the Yarra Valley, particularly around Warburton, and they had the money and the resources to develop that and support it. So in a lot of ways, if it hadn't have been for the works at Britannia Creek being burned out in the 1926 fires, they would have operated well into the 1950s, because what they were producing was much sought after. So I've been wandering the hills of there since 1958 as a bushwalking. I had an old Bushwalkers Club magazine or handbook which described doing all the walks along the various tramways and stuff, and so it sort of followed on from there that I would become more interested. And then in the early days when I was working in Melbourne, I had spent a fair bit of time with Norm Wadeson, who was I was on a committee with for Puffing Billy, and so we used to meet at lunchtime and preparing a list of all the tramways, timber tramways and light railways in Australia. And then one day, I think it was Les Pill, said to me, "Oh, you need to meet up with Frank Stanford, because he's got a society going called the Victorian Light Railway Society, and that would be right up your alley." So I did, and for many years I was a member in the early days, and then I worked overseas for a while, so I sort of lost touch. But now I'm back in my middle 80s, and I'm still dead keen on light railways. So thank you all.
Oh, thank you, Geoff, for a very interesting presentation. Yeah, it's an area that's up there that's been well worked over around Britannia Creek and all that. In fact, it was a book published years ago on the Britannia Creek, but you've sort of expanded on Cuming Smith quite substantially and what their other involvements were. So it's been most interesting.
Yeah, they're a fascinating company, that's for sure.
Yeah, yeah. This plant at Yarraville, wasn't it? Their factory.
Yeah.
Whereabouts in Yarraville?
Well, it's right along where they had wharf frontage and
Yeah.
the old Maribyrnong goods line that's now been long gone, pulled up.
Yep.
And they were there between what is not Sim Street, one of the streets there.
Yep.
In that run, when you come off from Footscray Road,
Yeah. Yeah.
into it, you had the maize products, which was the Federal Cast Company, which was Federal Timber, and then you went a bit further along, and then you had Cuming Smiths. There's still a couple of their old buildings there. They've got a heritage overlay on them. So, but the rest of the works, which was purchased by ICI, has now been pulled down. And sort of went out of. It was too old, really, and ICI or Orica now have built new plants to the north of Melbourne. So
yeah. It was interesting earlier in the piece you said how it was on the banks of the Yarra River, which became the Maribyrnong River, and that was because the Yarra River got diverted through Coode Canal.
That's right, yeah.
Yeah, and I remember in the 1950s, it was still part of the old Yarra River, beside on the south side of Footscray Road. It was like a billabong.
That's right, and they most of the raw materials for fertiliser that came in by boat. As I say, the Mount Lyell company shipped all the stuff over there, their priorities, and that.
Yeah,
they had some big cranes. I haven't been back there for years, but along the wharf, and then you also had gas and fuel, and you had a couple of other places there too that used the rail and the wharf.
Yeah.
And I remember years ago walking along there, and at where the maize products was and the Federal Cast Company, they had a fenced off yard there, and there was a great pile of old timber bogies and other paraphernalia there, which had been sent down from the bush.
Yeah. Yeah, Colonial Sugar, they were around that area too, weren't they?
Yeah, that's right. And they used to bring their sugar in by bag initially, and then later on they brought it in by ship, and they had big, large unloading cranes on the wharf. So, no, it was a pretty industrialised area, and a big workforce there too.
Yeah.
So, as I say, there's lots of heritage studies being done along there by the various councils and what have you, and Melbourne University has got an enormous amount of information on the Cuming family, and there's been a couple of books written on James Cuming, and he was, and they say there's a statue too, so he was a real go-getter in the area.
Yeah. All right, anybody got any questions? If you have, push your space bar down to talk.
Yeah, I've got one. How long was Westwood Ho at Britannia Creek?
Well, it was there until the early 1918, 1919. But what happened to it, I don't know.
I think it was still around, abandoned in the 1930s, somewhere along the tramway between Britannia Creek and Britannia Siding. That was reported by railway enthusiasts at the time, but it disappeared, I think, sometime in the 1930s.
Yeah, well, usually scrap metal disappeared very quickly if people could get access to it.
Yeah.
And just a second question Please proceed.
Yeah, now if I've got it right, Westwood Ho was a Bagnall locomotive.
Yes, it was.
Yeah.
It was very, very small. I think it was too small for the job, actually.
Yeah. Quite small. Now it had previously operated on the tramway at Forest in the Eastern Otways until about 1907.
That's right.
Yeah.
And they would have sold it because it was too small for their operation too.
Yeah. And that was 3'6" at the time too.
Yes, they changed the gauge.
Yeah. 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 Quite interesting.
It worked in South Gippsland too for a while. Mason's Tramway, I think.
It wasn't at Cropley's, was it?
No, South Gippsland along the coast somewhere. I think it might have been Mason's Tramway. Would be mentioned in the book In the Shadow of the Prom.
In Mike's book, yeah.
Yes.
Off in Tasmania.
What's that?
Westwood Ho started off its life in Tasmania.
Did it? Had a complicated life. It was intended to go to the Sudan, I think.
Oh.
I think so.
Yeah. Oh. One of life's little mysteries. Any other questions? Surely.
I've got another one if that's okay.
Yeah, that's fine.
Alrighty. Britannia siding, just based on the picture that you showed us before, it didn't look very substantial. Was it just like a spur off the main line, not a loop or?
No, it was just a dead end siding, and you had the tramway coming along on a raised boardwalk, so that they were loading the timber at the right height into the wagons, and they had to talk hard to the railways to get that siding put in. But as I say, Cuming Smith had lots of money and they had lots of influence, and the commissioners stood to attention when they asked for something. So, as did the Forest Commission too. So the board of directors of Cuming Smith had a lot of the highlight people of in the industry in Melbourne. So.
Yeah. The Britannia siding was located right beside the Warburton Highway.
Yeah.
That as you're driving out of Yarra Junction towards Warburton, and you parallel the railway line for a bit, and then it turns northwards, veers away from the highway, and that's where the siding was.
It was a pretty tight, and as I say, they had timber stacks there, and that they sold their timber from too. So, but there wasn't much room to move.
Yeah. No.
Do you have any thoughts on how they'd service that siding? I mean, like I can sort of understand how you take loaded wagons because the locomotive would back its train back in to pick up, but how would you drop off empties?
They did have on the tramway there was a loop there, but it was a bit further out. It was over the highway before you start to go up the hill towards the Britannia Works.
You might have found, because it was so close to Yarra Junction, that they actually pushed empties out to the siding from Yarra Junction.
Yeah, that's possible.
Yeah.
I guess.
And
this is the VR, you mean?
Yes.
Yeah, and the same could be said from them picking up. They could pick up either from with the train coming from Warburton, or just doing a bit of a shunt at Yarra Junction.
Yeah, well, there weren't that many Warburton passenger trains, so they were pretty safe. But Cuming Smith was sending a load of freight out every day.
Yeah, okay, pretty good. Yeah.
Geoff, that being the case, you wonder why they didn't rebuild the works after the 1926 fires. Is that because of difficulty in obtaining good quality timber after that time, or were there other factors?
Well, I think the works, as I say, they cost them, 50-odd thousand to build. And the way I read the report was that the destruction meant that it would have cost them, probably £200,000 to redo it. And they decided that there was more money in seasoning timber than there was in distilling it. And they had other ideas at Yarraville that they could create their acids through. So they didn't really need to do the distillation. So they just kept on going, and then bought other timber, the Enterprise Mill and Grant Seasoning Works and stuff, because there was a fair bit of money in dressed timber, seasoned timber, and particularly the hardwood coming out of the Wolverton Ranges there.
One of the reasons they didn't rebuild was because the technique of distilling timber to get acetone and other chemicals had been superseded by other methods of creating those chemicals. The method was obsolete by 1926.
Yeah, and they also had the capacity at the Yarraville Works then to produce all their acids down there. So
sounds a bit like the failure of the powerlising process at Powelldown.
very similar.
Not quite the same thing. Powerlising was never successful.
No. On that subject, or sort of an unrelated question, or vaguely related, I suppose. I've got the book Powelldown by Frank and Geoff, and what's his name, Stuckey, is the third.
Yeah, Ted. Yeah.
Yeah, is he still around?
As far as he lives at Apollo Bay.
Okay.
And it's the last thing I heard. I think he's still alive. He was the president of the Apollo Bay Historical Society. So
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, something like that. Yeah,
Yeah, Geoff, the relationship with Mount Lyell was extremely strong, of course, and such that the pyrite traffic on the Mount Lyell Apt Railway actually formed greater tonnages than the copper ever did in latter years. And they built a pyrite wharf specifically at Strawn for loading pyrite. The copper was loaded round by the railway station, but then they'd load the pyrite round on the pyrite wharf, which was further round. And it was a pretty constant flow across to not only Yarraville, but to South Australia as well. I think most of the Western Australian pyrite came from local mines there. But Mount Lyell certainly got plenty of pyritic ore even today.
yeah,
That's not working.
I remember being down at Strawn in the 1960s and seeing all the old wagons and stuff just piled up there and along the wharf. But yeah, it did. And the cranes they had at Yarraville for unloading that were massive, big wharf cranes. It was quite a continuous stream of ships coming in.
Yeah, we were still exporting at that stage when the market had sort of played its game, pyrite right up into the 1980s by the time. And when they built their fleet of trucks to cart their concentrate and pyrite to Strawn, one of the main things was the amount of pyrite they were still carting. So every so often you couldn't sell it for a while, so they'd get a great stockpile at the mine, and then suddenly it'd disappear. But it was terrible stuff to handle.
I can imagine.
Yeah. Just a matter of interest on with Westwood Ho, the locomotive continued to be used on a more or less regular basis until 1915. From around 1910, it was stabled and open outside its shed adjacent to the main line. and that shed got pulled down and had been out of use for many years because the tramway really stopped operating in 1930. So Westwood Ho hadn't been used for about 15 years.
Got a bit more information on Westwood Ho. John Browning has put something in the chat messages.
Oh, right.
Westwood Ho was ordered by agents J. Terry and Company for Beaconsfield Tramway, Tasmania in 1885. Its name Khartoum probably came from the so-called Battle of that name when General Gordon met his fate that year. So apparently it wasn't intended to go to Sudan. If it went to Beaconsfield originally, that was 3-foot gauge. Must have been converted to 3-foot 6 gauge at some stage and then back to 3-foot gauge. Very strange.
Yeah. Wheels must have been loose on those axles.
Well, yeah, it was easy transfer. Yeah, so.
Yeah. I have read somewhere about some bush blacksmith at a sawmill re-gauged a locomotive with no more than a hammer and a coal chisel.
Yeah, that was the Rowan, both the Rowan cars at Forest, 5'3" to 3'6".
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, the axle work was done at a foundry in Geelong, but the frames were converted by that cold chisel method.
Very good. Right. Any more questions? No? Or
One other
information?
comment I could say, Bill, is that when I lived in Blackburn, the neighbour across the road had worked in the sawmills, I think coming down to Murialloc or one of those. He started there at 14 and his job was to come down with the horses, with the wagon loaded with sawn timber down to the VR railway, then load that into the wagons there, and then on the way back, take the horse back, and he had to check and replace any of the wooden rails. And eventually, he got his boiler engine driver certificate, and he could work the inclines with the winding gear and everything.
Right.
And later on, when I knew him, he was the boiler man at the Myer Emporium in Melbourne, and he used to, because they had big oil-fired boilers there, and then at the Christmas thing, he used to drive. They had a whole series of Bassett locos that they used to run around for the children in the basement, and he used to be the driver of that. But yeah, he was. He said it was tough, and I forget how much he said he got paid, but he was 14, and you took whatever job you could find in those days.
Yeah. Yeah. Interesting. Yeah. All right. Is that it?
I'd just like to say thanks for the excellent talk. And I plugged my computer using the HDMI cable into my television, and so I had a big screen view of the slides, so it worked out very well.
Well done. Yeah, I wish I'd done the same. So,
Yeah, it was an excellent chat, and I really appreciate you sharing your knowledge. It was very good. Thank you.
yeah, my pleasure.
All right. All right. On that note, thank you very much, Geoff, for an very interesting presentation. And would everybody give a wave to Geoff, because clapping is a bit hard to hear.
Thanks, Geoff. Really awesome.
All right.
Thank you all.
All right. Okay. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in. Hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. And until next time, hope all's well in your world. All the best.
Thank you, Bill.
Good night.
Thanks, Frank.
Yeah, thanks,
Thanks,
Geoff.
Frank.